Kingdoms in Conflict by Charles Colson. An insider's challenging view of politics, power, and the pulpit. Prologue, March 24th, 1998. General Brent Slocum's t-shirt stuck to his sweaty back and powerful, heaving shoulders as he grinned at his 29-year-old opponent. His adjutant's urgent breathing filled the small handball court. "Gonna make it through the last point, Rob?" the general asked. It was a pleasure at 54 to whip a younger man. Suddenly there was a pounding on the door. "General," another aide shouted from outside. "Command center on the line, sir." Slocum hesitated. He wanted to finish the game. The pounding resumed. "All right, Sloan," the general bawled. "I heard you. Those boys better have something worth my time." Someone was forever using the channels. He wondered whether anybody could get through if a real emergency command, like war, was needed. The youthful voice on the other end of the mobile communications line was shaking, probably scared half to death to be speaking to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. "It's the White House Signal Agency calling, sir. Shall I patch it in?" "Of course," Slocum grunted. Almost instantly he heard a second voice, crisp and precise. "General Slocum, POTUS has asked you to come immediately, sir." The diplomatic entrance. "Enter through the south gate." "Can I give an affirmative, sir?" "Of course," he grunted again, then tossed the receiver in his aide's direction as he headed for the locker room. The White House? 6 in the morning? Why on earth do they use an acronym for every last living thing in this city? Slocum grumbled to himself, including the President of the United States. 8 minutes later, he strode in full dress uniform toward his waiting car. From Fort Myer to the White House was a 10-minute drive without traffic. His driver, the Army's best, had practiced many times. Fortunately, the city was just coming to life. Most of the streets were gray and deserted. The general sat back in his limousine as his limousine raced toward its destination, his thoughts swirling. He had seen the president only a few times since becoming chairman in January. Never had he entered the White House outside regular hours. Something hot was up. He ran through the possibilities. It might be Mexico. The Sandinista-backed guerrillas had killed 33 in a bomb blast in Acapulco last Friday. Slocum still didn't have an op plan ready to seal the border. He'd be in trouble if the old man wanted that. The Middle East? That very morning, before leaving for the handball court, Slocum had glanced around over a report of 2 new Soviet divisions moving into Iran. Or perhaps, though less likely, it was Britain. Nobody had anticipated the vehemence of the Kinnock government when they discovered 2 Poseidon subs in their waters in violation of Britain's nuclear-free policy. Go to the residence, he had been ordered. Whatever it was important. The blue-jacketed White House policeman saluted and waved the general's car through the heavy black steel gates and up the long curved driveway that cut across the south lawn of the White House. Slocum counted 5 limousines, all larger than his, at the door. The Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of State. Getting out of the car, he stood for a moment and gazed up at the light scum of late snow clinging to the gutters of the residence. This could be war, he thought. "Right this way, sir," announced a young Marine. He steered the general through the oval-shaped diplomatic receiving room and up the flight of marble steps to the great center hall. From there, the general followed him toward another flight of stairs, carpeted in thick red pile. They led, he knew, to the family quarters, although he had never been above the first floor. At the head of the stairs stood a Secret Service agent, a plug in one ear. He glanced at the general and then seemed to look through him. The agent's suit sagged as though he'd worn it for a week. It annoyed Slocum. After a life in the military, sloppy civilian dress was difficult to accept. His Marine escort clicked his heels softly and announced, "The Lincoln sitting room, sir." He nodded to the door of the study directly off the president's bedroom. The Secret Service agent leaned to one side and swung the door open, never taking his eyes off the stairway. Larry Parrish, the sandy-haired Ivy League White House Chief of Staff, was the only one to nod at Slocum as he entered. The others were preoccupied in knots of uneasy conversation. Parrish waved the general into a hard-backed antique chair, then caught President Hopkins' eye. "Everyone's here," he said. The small room, which had once served Abraham Lincoln as an office, was crowded with antiques. This morning it seemed even more crowded by the egos of the handful of powerful men the president had summoned. Parrish had taken their measure long ago, however, and he somehow managed to make these egos work together for whatever goals the president chose. He knew people, he knew the system, and he had a finely tuned political sense for what would fly on the 6 o'clock news. "I'm a technician," he would say with a smile when pressed about his role in the government. He thought of that now as he surveyed the men before him. Though the general was the most recent of the president's top appointments, Parrish had known Brent Slocum through a decade of Washington receptions. The general was the best sort of military man, politically unimaginative but quick to seize the main issues. Neither a paper pusher nor a cowboy, he had just the kind of solid, capable confidence to command any situation. Seated next to Slocum was Alexander Hartwell, the Secretary of Defense, revered as the nastiest infighter in Washington's brutal bureaucracy. Parrish had often thought he was glad Hartwell was their SOB. He would make a formidable enemy. A veteran of 20 years in the House, Hartwell had worked the deals reconciling the Christian right to the Republican hardliners that laid the foundation for Hopkins' election. For his reward, Hartwell had demanded and been given defense. He sometimes worked hard to stay one jump ahead of Hartwell and to remind him who was president. Next to Hartwell was Secretary of State Henry Lovelace. Parrish suspected Henry was out of his depth, and so did a lot of other people who referred to him privately as Secretary Love. Lovelace owed his job to his friendship with the president dating back to college days. The president was comfortable with him, and his weaknesses were compensated for by the strength of Allen Davies, the National Security Advisor. It was doubtful anyway whether Davies could have worked with a strong counterpart at State. Davies, whose wispy appearance, blank stare, and ubiquitous bow tie belied his power, crouched in the room's one overstuffed chair. He always reminded Parrish of a time bomb, staring and ticking. Davies read everything and forgot nothing. The president had come to rely on him during his 14 months in the White House, almost dangerously so, Parrish thought. Finally, slumped on a rosewood chair purchased by Mary Todd Lincoln, was the professional attorney general, Hyman Levin. How the man could talk! He kept the right-wingers happy, crusading with the vigor of the recently converted. Fortunately, though, he was a realist who knew how to talk on one line and compromise on another. Any of the 5 men, with the possible exception of Lovelace, would have dominated another setting, but bluster as they would, in the end they did the president's bidding. How Hopkins managed this trick, Parrish had not quite figured out. Part of it, he sometimes mused, was physical. The president looked like the president, tall, with a magnificent silver mane, a jutting jaw that suggested strength to men, and sparkling blue eyes that charmed women. And he sounded like God Almighty, his thunderclap voice rising out of some lower register. Mostly, though, Parrish had begun to believe that the president dominated them by his sheer goodness. After surviving decades of politics, Parrish didn't believe goodness had anything to do with effective leadership. But Hopkins was different. He radiated something that made you feel morally small after being around him. Despite these natural assets, Shelby Hopkins had come late to political life. For over 20 years, he had been a professor of history and later academic dean at Baylor University. He had entered the political arena in the 80s when evangelical Christians came out of nowhere to become a major force in national politics. Hopkins had been nominated to run for governor of Texas, chiefly because Republican political consultants thought he looked and sounded good on television. To the surprise of many, he had governed imaginatively and circumspectly, coming to national prominence through his handling of the Dallas AIDS riot, which had put him on the network news every night for 2 weeks. When the Republican hardliners patched things up with the Christian right after the big split in 1992, Hopkins was a natural candidate for president. Parrish's thoughts were interrupted now as the president looked up from some papers, smiled briefly, and looked at each of the men. "Gentlemen, let's get started. Sorry to call you in so early this morning. I appreciate your promptness." There was just a trace of Texas in his voice. "I've asked you here to the residence because if we were seen at this hour in the West Wing, the press would be on to things and nothing flat. We can't have that. We seem to have a little trouble brewing in Israel. You all know that the Knesset has been paralyzed for some time. with neither the Likud nor the Labor parties able to get a stable majority to form a government. Hopkins held up the black leather notebook engraved with gold letters, "For the President's eyes only," and continued. But this morning's intelligence summary suggests that the log jam is breaking. Both parties have been bargaining with small fringe parties, as you know. Other sources say that the Likud party is very close to striking a deal with the Tahiyya party. In fact, since it's mid-afternoon in Israel now, they may have already reached an agreement. I talked this over with Alan earlier this morning and decided we'd better get to work on it right away. Parrish scribbled notes furiously. This was the first indication of what had stirred the president. Was it truly an emergency? The difference between the two chief Israeli parties appeared minuscule, especially in their attitudes toward the Arab world. So far as the U.S. was concerned, it made little difference which actually gained power. At the president's invitation, Alan Davies leaned forward and, consulting a red notebook that looked like the president's but without the lettering, told them more than anyone could possibly want to know at 6:30 in the morning about the tiny, fanatical religious party known as Tahiyya. The leader was Yosef Tsuria, an Albanian refugee who favored driving all Arabs out of the occupied territories. Tsuria also believed that God had given Israel title to all land west of the Euphrates River, territory inconveniently known as Iraq, Lebanon, and Syria. But Parrish almost missed the emphasis because of Davies' monotone. Suria's big scheme was religious. He wanted to blow up the Dome of the Rock, the sacred Muslim shrine in Jerusalem, and build a temple in its place. Davies concluded his briefing with a quote from Suria. "We must establish a permanent place of prayer on the Mount. It is a desecration of God to enter the Mount under the authority of an Arab guard." "I might add," Davies said dryly, "that they're quite serious. They're being bankrolled by some big industrialists in Israel, along with a fundamentalist group in Texas, which we gather has handed them at least $25 million. They've got men in training." A trace of smile curved his lips. "Not only commandos, but priests. They're in training to perform Jewish sacrificial rites." "Priests? Sacrificial rites?" Parrish searched the faces of the other men. Did they understand the significance here? He didn't. Nor could he decipher the strange, excited light in the president's eyes. "I hate to sound uninformed," Parrish said finally, "but so what?" "So what?" the president echoed slowly. "So what? This could mean war." "The Likud party isn't going to let some marginal crowd of fanatics carry them into war," Parrish said. "Anyway, it sounds to me like their big thing is religion, not politics." "Yes, that's right, Larry," the president said, nodding his silvery head. "That's just the problem. They take the Old Testament prophecies very seriously. And on the question of whether Likud would allow them to carry the nation into war, that's why I called you together. This morning's briefing says, and Alan tells me the sources are impeccable, that Surya and the Likud leader, Moshe Aarons, are in negotiations right now. And Aarons has tentatively agreed to look the other way when Surya's commandos blow up the Dome of the Rock. What they've yet to agree on is whether Aarons will promise to declare Israeli sovereignty over the whole Temple Mount. It looks as though it could actually happen. The Jewish temple could be rebuilt. And that would mean war, added Attorney General Levin. The Arabs are very religious, too, you know. They've always said they are prepared to die before any Jew will pray on the Mount. Parrish shifted uncomfortably. His own Episcopalian background differed considerably from the president's Southern Baptist roots, and though this had never created any strain between them, Parrish felt out of his depth when it came to the finer nuances of the religious world. "I'm sorry, Mr. President," he said apologetically. "Maybe everyone else understands this, but I'm not with it. Could you bear with me here until someone explains about the temple? I must have missed that briefing." He saw to his relief that at least Hartwell and Slocum were in the same boat he was, for Slocum nodded at his request and Hartwell was wearing a tight, bemused smile. "Maybe I can get Hyman to brief us on that, Larry. He was quite a Levitical scholar up at Yale, you know. Now, since his conversion, he knows even more than he used to. Explain it, will you, Hy?" The president and his attorney general grinned at each other. This suggestion did not set Parrish at ease. He knew of Levin's conversion to Christianity, but what in heaven's name was a Levitical scholar? And the glances exchanged by Levin and the president, as if they shared some secret fraternity ritual, made him feel like an outsider. Levin had a high, choir boy voice and held his chin up slightly when he talked. He loved the chance to lecture. I suppose you know, Larry, that the ancient Israelites worshipped in a temple built by Solomon in Jerusalem. By the time of King Hezekiah in 715 BC, worship was allowed nowhere else. That temple was destroyed, however, by Babylonian armies in 586 BC. Then came the Babylonian captivity, after which the returning Jews built a second temple. That was later replaced by an elaborate monument for King Herod. Levin grinned. You have heard of King Herod? Parrish nodded. Good, continued Levin in a high ironic tone. But the main fact you need to know is that in AD 70 the Jews revolted against Rome, and the Romans retaliated by destroying their temple. It was never rebuilt. The Muslims erected a mosque over the ruins centuries later. During the Crusades, the Christians gained control and turned it into a church. But in recent centuries, it has reverted to the Arabs. Today it is the Dome of the Rock, one of the holiest Muslim shrines. They would view its desecration as an unspeakable outrage. Now that, Larry, poses quite a problem, because the devout Jew cannot just forget the temple. They considered the site sacred. The temple originally built there contained the Holy of Holies, where no one could set foot except the high priest once a year, without desecrating God's holy name. So the Muslim control of that spot is a desecration of all that is sacred to them. So somebody gets desecrated no matter what, Parrish interjected. Very good, Larry. Furthermore, the Jew cannot fulfill the Old Testament sacrificial laws unless a temple is rebuilt on that site. Promises of Messiah's return to a new temple are found in Scripture. There, and only there, does he wish to make his residence. So far, the devout Jew, a rebuilt temple is more important than the renewal of the state of Israel. But they have synagogues, Parrish said. A synagogue is not the temple. A synagogue is a house of prayer, but you cannot do the blood sacrifices there. Parrish's face twisted into a combination of pain and disbelief. Blood sacrifices? Yes, a sheep, a goat, a bull, killed on the altar and burned on the perpetual fire. What in the world? There's one more thing I should add, Levin interrupted him. To the devout Christian who pays attention to prophecy, the rebuilding of the ancient temple will set the stage for the last great act of history. It will signal Armageddon. That explains why Christian groups are funding the Tehillah. The temple will pave the way for Christ's triumphant return. Levin leaned back, pleased with his presentation. The president looked inquiringly at Parrish. Does it make sense now, Larry? Obviously, while these reports are frightening, there's some excitement that comes with them, too. You can't help but wonder if these could be the events we've all waited for. Parrish felt a sudden tightening in his stomach as he remembered former President Frank's charges in the 96 campaign that Hopkins would try to make Bible prophecy self-fulfilling and bring on Armageddon. Never before had it crossed Parrish's mind that those accusations were anything but hysteria. Brent Slocum struggled to accommodate his 6'3" frame to the undersized antique chair. His head was spinning, particularly with the Attorney General's last words. He had visited Israel several times, but to observe Israeli defenses on the Golan Heights, not mosques in Jerusalem. He was a man of war, comfortable talking about supply operations and air support, not Armageddon. He glanced at Hardwell. He knew that behind his narrowed eyes and high forehead, the Secretary of Defense was computing fast. Slocum didn't particularly like Hartwell, but he did expect him to talk in terms that made some sense. Hartwell didn't disappoint him. So the gist of it is, Mr. President, Armageddon or no Armageddon? We need to head off this deal. It's explosive. Why would Aarons even entertain it? He must know all this better than we do. Davies leaned forward and answered before Hopkins could respond. Aarons is an old fool, he said flatly. He'd do anything to regain power. And this issue, strange as it sounds to us, is really quite popular within certain powerful segments of the Israeli population. Not with Aarons, Slocum blurted. I know the man. He doesn't have a religious bone in his body. Right, Davies said, but he's a politician who knows how to play religious issues. If he's a politician, Hartwell sneered, then he ought to know that Israel's existence depends on the good opinion of the United States. If this cockamamie scheme is as serious as you seem to think, then why don't we get him on the phone and tell him to forget it? No ifs and or buts. Now hold on, Secretary Lovelace interjected. That's no way to treat our ally. What if he says no? Parrish asked, looking up from his note-taking. Could you back it up? With a bullet, if necessary, Hartwell said. We have agents who would find it a pleasure. Hopkins shook his head violently, and Parrish quickly interjected. Such matters are never discussed in the president's presence. Slocum grabbed onto a possibility that made some sense to him. I can have the Delta Force in the area ready to go in 12 hours, sir. Hold on now, said Parrish. If I understand it correctly, the question isn't military in nature. We could drop an atom bomb on Jerusalem if it came to that. The question is, could we back it up politically? Do you really think we can dictate policy to Israel, our only reliable ally in the Middle East? You think the Israel lobby would give us room to maneuver? And Aarons knows just how much leeway we have. Come off it, Larry, said Hartwell. We can make Aarons come around if we're willing to get rough. President Hopkins had moved from his chair to the window overlooking the south lawn, but hadn't said a word. It was unusual for him not to take part in the discussion. He enjoyed a spirited debate, but this morning he seemed far away, his eyes fixed on some distant point. Gentlemen, he said finally, we must keep in mind that the very real possibility that this situation is beyond us all. The words hung suspended in the air for a long, awkward moment. Only Levin nodded. Hartwell shook his head with annoyance and relatively reached into his jacket pocket for a cigarette. Then he remembered that no one smoked in the White House anymore. Mr. President, he said angrily, whatever cosmic forces may be involved here, Syria must be stopped. There's nothing more dangerous than allowing religious fanaticism to replace seasoned political judgment. Are you talking about me or Syria? The president asked coldly. Being called a religious zealot during the campaign had stung Hopkins. He had run on the platform, "Return America to God," and left no doubt where he stood, but the fanatic label always annoyed him. No, Mr. President, of course not. I'm talking about Syria. He's the menace. Good, said Hopkins, putting on his half-circle reading glasses and picking up a well-worn brown leather Bible from a table beside Davy's chair. At the risk of appearing fanatical, I'd like to read you all a passage from Ezekiel. It was written 5 centuries before the birth of Christ. He flipped a few pages until he located his text. Listen to this. My dwelling place will be with them. I will be their God, and they will be my people. Then the nations will know that I, the Lord, make Israel holy, when my sanctuary is among them forever. Ezekiel tells us that Gog, the nation, will lead all the other powers of darkness against Israel, will come out of the north. Biblical scholars have been saying for generations that Gog must be Russia. What other powerful nation is to the north of Israel? None but Russia. None. But it didn't seem to make sense before the Russian Revolution, when Russia was a Christian country. Now that Russia had become communistic and atheistic, it does. Now that Russia has set itself against God, it fits the description of Gog perfectly. President Hopkins put down the Bible, removed his glasses, and ran a hand through his hair. He stared into the eyes of each one by one. Slocum felt self-conscious. Parrish, who usually had his head down, taking notes, stared back up at Hopkins. I ran my campaign on the Bible, Hopkins said, and I intend to run this nation on the Bible. Let's keep in mind while we make our plans that God has already made his. Then the president smiled and broke the tension. Now let's get down to business. We've talked enough. You know... Yeah.